Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinars this afternoon. So let's start by introducing our very special guest for today, Professor Daniel Vukovich. So Professor Daniel is Associate Professor at Hong Kong University School of Humanities, and he is the head of the Literature Department as well as a program in Literary and Cultural Studies. Professor Vukovich, he has more than 29 years of teaching and research experience. He has got his PhD in English and the unit of criticism and interpretive theory from University of Illinois in USA. He has published a number of research papers in journals, and his research is being celebrated all over the world. He is as well the author of two books, China and Orientalism, Western Knowledge Production and the People Republic of China. It was on 2012, and another recent one, Illiberal China, the Ideological Challenge of the People Republic of China. It was in 2019, and currently he's working on his third book, after Autonomy. In this book, he is examining Hong Kong's recent politics and turmoil since its return to China. His research areas are interdisciplinary, principally concerned with politics and intellectual history. And today he will be sharing with us his expert opinion on reading China politically after globalization. With that, I ask you all, please give your full attention to Professor Vukovich, and after this we'll have a Q&A section for an open discussion. Professor Daniel.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. It's very much an honor and privilege to be here. To be here from my same old office, but speaking to you all. And I hope to get to maybe do that in person sometime. I have not been back to Delhi in a long time, but I used to go, I won't say often, but I've been there a few times and absolutely loved it. And I still have, several friends who are either based in India or from India, and I'm still in contact with around the world. And one of whom actually is kind of related to some of my work. Professor, she's retired, but Professor Utsa Patnaik over at JNU, I got to know years ago and just saw her last fall at a conference up in Beijing. And yeah, so great. And let me see. Now, it's my first time using the Microsoft one, but I'm sure it's pretty much the same as all the other ones I've been using. I'm just going to find the share button here. Oh, and I'm already getting a couple of the ones I want to look at. Okay. Let's see. I think you all can see this. That's nice and easy. Yeah. Okay, great. All right. Make sure my phone is off. Okay, great. So I thought what I would do is just talk a little bit about my two books or my work, and then kind of introduce you to them, and give an overview on those and try to connect that to post-colonial theory, post-colonial studies, and particularly the study of politics, which is my own particular interest on this. So yeah, my background is actually kind of in cultural studies and critical theory at Illinois. And I was there for a while, and then I was teaching in UC Santa Cruz and had friends in the History of Consciousness program, politics department, stuff like that, which also, as I was finishing my dissertation, this is years ago, but kind of led to my kind of refine my interest, particularly in politics, even though my background's kind of in English and humanities. And I teach humanities and all kinds of things at Hong Kong U, but my interests have been really gravitated towards politics, protests, kind of traditional sense of politics of around the questions around the state and geopolitical conflict and things like that. Yeah. So let me just get into this. So the China and Orientalism I'll talk about first, all right? This was my dissertation book, by the way. And the title is just not at all trendy. I had wanted to call this thing Sinological Orientalism to make it sound very kind of more memorable or something like that. But I'm kind of glad they didn't do that, and they kind of gave me this more traditional title, straightforward thing. So I'll go over this a little bit, and it's where the connection to the question of the post-colonial really kind of comes from me. So yeah, Orientalism, as you may know, was obviously a kind of monumental book from Edward Said in 1978. And it had a kind of transformative effect, I mean, along with other people, but on the disciplines, particularly in the humanities, and then slowly but surely kind of getting into social sciences a little bit, some history departments as well, kind of resisted, got back to it. And of course, it was focused on the representation of the Middle East, or that kind of traditional Orient, right? And of Islam and Arabic peoples, and that kind of original conflict, so to speak, between the West or Europe and the Ottoman Empire, right? And that whole thing, right? So anyway, I'm sure you know this book, which still kind of remains a classic. When I came to it as a matter of studying theory and trying to understand what post-colonialism is, and actually Foucault as well, right? Trying to understand Foucault through Said. And I think it's still one of the best books to really understand Foucault, every bit as good as his own really kind of interesting and fascinating histories, Said's Orientalism. But the question of China, as you all probably know, then doesn't really appear in that book. He brings it up and kind of brackets it and says, look, for an American audience of his readers, the Orient will signify the Far East more than what he's going to talk about, right? And so on and so forth. And then it kind of pops up a little bit in his book, but not too much, okay? So of course, then that gave me and gives all of us a kind of opportunity to take this critique of knowledge of the construction of the Orient to other places and kind of revise it and look at it that way. So I basically tried to do that with China, because it struck me as I kind of belatedly came to the study of China and its politics, that there was not much theory, not much interpretation, not much kind of self-awareness or self-reflexivity in that field in terms of how all of these foreign scholars or diasporic scholars represent China. Yeah, so it just was a kind of interesting gap there. And so far as that book was taken up early in the 80s and 90s, it was largely in a kind of dismissive gesture to say that this doesn't apply to us, right? Maybe it applies to popular culture, maybe it applies to these other areas, maybe it applies to Islam, but it doesn't apply to us in China because we're different, basically, or blah, blah, blah. I won't go into that. So I kind of wanted to kind of make a case that that was not so, right? So the argument in this book around Orientalism, in a nutshell, is, first of all, you know, it does apply, the kind of critique of the discipline and critique of the production of knowledge of the PRC within area studies, within kind of intellectual and proper discourse, does actually really apply, okay, contrary to what they're saying. But I've tried to argue that it kind of turns on a new logic, right? So if you look here at the first page, you may well remember this quote from his book, and it's from good old Rudyard Kipling, the British colonial bureaucrat and author, right? I'm sure you all know. But from that, what is the name of the poem? Excuse me, The Ballad of East and West. There you go. Anyway, this is the line in the poem. Oh, East is East, West is West, never the twain shall meet. So Said refers to this line in particular as expressing the kind of logic of Orientalism. And it turns on an essential difference, as he puts it, between East and West, or Orient and Occident, right? And on the basis of that division or difference or binary, all of this other stuff kind of begins and spins out, right? So that the Orient is different and the Oriental is different, and custom, mind, religion, culture, history, blah, blah, all that kind of stuff, right? So for reasons I won't totally all rehearse here, the question of China is a bit different here, right? And my argument in the book is that it has kind of moved from a question of essential difference, which is almost a kind of classical, kind of almost racist sentiment, right? Or racialized essential sentiment, okay? To one of it kind of now becoming the same, right? Perhaps not all of the Orient, but certainly the case of China. Much of that discourse from the 70s, 80s onwards, right, really was heavily dominated by the idea that China is finally and slowly becoming the same, right? So it follows a logic of modernization, a kind of modern 20th century American kind of logic, as opposed to this of the European kind of essential difference, classical state sentiment, if you will, right? Another way to think of this, I just throw up in the book a little bit, there's a modernization, which is everyone's becoming the same because they're following the same process, right? A kind of bastardized Hegelianism almost, or modernism basically, right? Another way to think of that is also the logic of the missionary, right? And the missionaries were somewhat small, but quite influential and powerful in China, but more so even on the kind of Orientalist discourse about China, right? And being kind of Christian proselytizers and missionaries, they have a kind of logic of sameness as well, right? Now, Said's book doesn't talk about this, right? This emphasis on modernization, sameness, becoming the same, that kind of stuff. Because often within colonialism, this also comes up that, you know, the colonized, the people who were ruling are essentially just like us. They will become the same as us eventually. And thanks to our religion, thanks to our colonization, so on and so forth, right? So this is the kind of twist that I'm trying to put onto it, because it does seem that that follows the representation and study of the PRC in particular kind of follows that in the 20th century, later 20th century, and even up to the present. Okay, so that will be all maybe kind of familiar, right? But yeah, the other spin that I gave it in this book, and you can see it more, where do I have it here? This last chapter, China reference, and Orientalism and the global economy. I bring it up again, and I kind of bring it up in the first chapter a bit. Not much on it in between. But this same logic of sameness can be thought of also as a kind of Marxist or Frankfurt School or Hegelian kind of Marxist analysis of general equivalence, right? It's really from that, as you may know, the kind of emphasis on the question of value and reification and value theory, okay? Not as the economists might talk about it, but as the Frankfurters might have, right? That there's a certain logic of general equivalence that subtends the rise of capitalism in Marx's analysis. That's essentially what he's getting at with all his long, the chapter on the commodity, which starts Das Kapital, and the money form of value, right? It's also his kind of little history and thought experiment around the genesis of an equivalent form of value into one thing, which is money, all right? So I won't rehearse all of that, but if you're familiar with the Frankfurt School or Lukács, or where I kind of got it all from, frankly, is Frederick Jameson, who has got a great book on Adorno called Late Marxism, and other work, kind of, even Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle kind of resonates with this, actually. This kind of reading or appreciation of Marxism as a kind of cultural method or analytic, yeah, equivalence, right? So it seemed to me that that is, to get back to that, all of these things are kind of coming together. The modernization impulse, the kind of Christian missionary logic, right? And the changes within China, beginning in the 70s, following, if you're not thinking too hard, if you're not looking at it too closely, but close enough, you see, well, wait a minute, it is kind of following this universal process, right? This is also the time of, you know, Fukuyama's end of history analysis with the fall of Berlin, East Germany and the whole empire of the Soviet Union happening at the same time, right? It really did seem like China was on this, and much of the rationale for United States policy in the final years of the Cold War, beginning with Nixon and onwards, was this logic of engaging with China, right? It gets less hostile, less xenophobic, and really starts to embrace that, maybe these folks are all right, you know, meaning even the party might be all right. You know, Deng Xiaoping was the, insofar as this matters, and in some ways it's a nice symbolism for us, he's the man of the year twice for Time magazine. Sorry, just check this out, a message. We're okay. All right. Wait a minute. Sorry, I hope I didn't lose my screen. Okay, you all still on my screen, I think?
Yes, we can see.
Okay.
We can
all
see
right,
the screen, yes.
All right. I want to make sure. So anyway, I was saying all these things kind of start to come together, right? The kind of changes in China as it pursues something that looks like a kind of capitalist modernity, not this communist Maoist thing, right? Markets, money, right? So on and so forth. Yeah. So that, anyway, the argument around Orientalism was that it's following this kind of new logic of sameness, right? But it's still Orientalist. And if you still kind of look at this as a discourse and unpack it, you can see that quite clearly. So what I did, what did I do? I did a lot of things. Some of them got me in trouble a little bit. Here's a question on method. I can skip that a little bit. Yeah, I can wind my way back to that. So I did this kind of critique in that book, a kind of theoretical project, right? And I tried to show how this discourse, New Orientalism, around China, not the whole world. I wish I could do the whole world, but I can't. Nobody can, really. You know, was kind of coming from various different strata, right? So I spent a lot of time in this book on area studies. Yes. Sorry, is it a question? Okay.
No, there is no questions.
Okay, all right, no problem. So anyway, I tried to look at this not just in terms of theory, but in terms of area studies. So in that book, there's a lot, I did a lot of reading of China studies from the 20th century onwards, okay? But also looking at literature from America and elsewhere, going back early to kind of anti-Chinese writings like Jack London as well. Film, the reception of Chinese cinema and how it was talked about and coded and celebrated when those products started coming into the United States and elsewhere in the 90s, especially late 80s and 90s. I looked at some of the debates on the famine statistics and how these were used and talked about from the 80s and 90s forwards, right? That's where Utsa Patnaik's work was really useful for me, because she wrote a little bit about China, but as you all may know, I mean, she works on this question of economic history, but famines and how they happen and how we account for them and how people define them, right, in India and in Indian agriculture, right? So that kind of thing. So I think one of the takeaways I would always tell other people as they look at, well, how do you do post-colonial studies? Or how do you do the kind of analysis of Orientalism or knowledge? And one essential move is to see how this stuff actually gets made from all kinds of directions and sources. It doesn't really just come from, say, area studies or historians or something like that, okay? We tend to think of them as being separate, right? But they're not, okay? So that's that. The other thing I did in this book, which is a little bit different, is if you remember Said's book, he quite rightly, actually, but he talks about how, of course, there is no Orient, it's a construction. And yet the colonies or the Middle East gets Orientalized, right? Now, I won't get into all of that discussion there, but basically what it means is that Said does not counter the representation of the Orient and Orientalist discourse by unpacking the real history or real story of the Orient, right? Because there is no abstract Orient, right? That's a very pointed and well taken point. But the other thing is that, well, then you tend to get a sense of the history of the Orient, or Orientalism, excuse me, as being so monolithic and dominant, right? And then there also has to be a space for like histories from below, or counter narratives, counter knowledges, counter whatever discourse to the dominant one, okay? And so he did a little bit of that in his other books and things like that too. So what I did and still continue to do is not just a kind of critique of representation the way I've talked about it so far, okay, but also kind of delve into what seems to me some of the historical or empirical points from the PRC in this case, or from the Mao era, that would counter this critique, or that would, excuse me, counter the Orientalist discourse. Okay, so then there's stuff in there about the achievements of Maoism. I looked at some like Mao era texts and talked about those, right? I looked at, when I did the chapter on Tiananmen, the Tiananmen Square protests and the kind of the repression and the brutal kind of crackdown of that in '89, I thought you also had to not only talk about some of the things the students were saying, right, but also the activity of the workers in Beijing, right, at that time, that arguably posed a far greater challenge to the authority and stability of the party, right? So look at some of the workers' poetry and rhetoric and things like that that they were doing and talking, right? So there's a double move there, basically, right? So you have the kind of critique of the discourse and knowledge and representation, but then try to kind of unearth or make a case, empirical in some fashion, that will counter that or show what's kind of occluded or transformed or misread by Orientalism, right? So that's how I think post-colonial critique, if you want to still call it that, that's how I feel like it should operate or go, basically. At least that's how I try to do it. Now, all right. I'll kind of now do, about in the second half, maybe not quite as long, on question the second book. So as a kind of transition, I called this presentation tonight, Reading China Politically. So the critique of knowledge, the critique of the production of knowledge is, I think is fairly obvious. I don't need to belabor it. It's already kind of political because you're framing it as something that kind of comes out of a colonial or imperial history, something comes out of a kind of Eurocentric history, something that comes out of a kind of brutal but very complex kind of global history of the West and the rest originally, right? One that in the case of China, of course, also then gets caught up in the Cold War and these kinds of things, right? So it's already kind of a cliche, but we all know that knowledge is power, right? And if you say it's power, you're also saying it's political, right? That it's going to involve interests, and that as Said and other people always said, knowledge is, it's not only historical, but it's always interested. If you exclude the natural sciences and certain things that would be not political or not political in any profound way or interesting way, perhaps, anything that involves human societies or human societies in relation and conflict, it's going to absolutely lend to politics, right? Or politics of knowledge, right? And you're also always going to be interpreting facts, right? There's always interpretation. Okay? The other thing I think that I took from his work and from others, like Stuart Hall and other people in the cultural studies world, is that, basically Hall, I think it was put it this way. So basically knowledge is about discourse, or it's like the fundamental terrain of politics, Stuart Hall always said, is about discourse. It's discursive, right? And I think what he meant by that, I've only come to appreciate it more, right? It isn't a kind of academic or pedantic point, or even a very Foucauldian point, really. But it's to say that politics kind of determine everything else and how it goes, right? And what determines politics in many ways is the stories we tell, the narratives we construct, the iconography we draw on, the beliefs and ideologies that work in societies, right? The tropes we use, that kind of thing, right? That often ends up really determining how knowledge is produced, right? If this makes sense. You kind of have to step, how do I put it? I'll just give you another example. I hope it's not too much of a digression. As we all kind of try to figure out this global mess that we're in, I mean, even before we got to COVID, one of the things I've been doing or reading a lot of lately was the work of Mark Blyth, B-L-Y-T-H. Who's he's originally Scottish, but he's an American or American-based economist or political economist at Brown University, I think. So Blyth became famous because he predicted Trump's victory, and he predicted Brexit based on his analysis of the kind of technocracy and the economies of Europe and the US, way before they happened. So I got fame from that. So I started reading his books. But anyway, one thing he made was simply that the kind of what we might call neoliberalism, or kind of austerity economics, right? That you've seen in India, you've seen even in some sense in China, but certainly in the United States, Hong Kong is even built on it, that kind of stuff. That kind of austerity economics really was just so successful in part because of the narrative it was able to tell, as opposed to that around Keynesianism and the kind of social democracy stuff, right? Essentially, that Blyth's argument is that, they had an appealing narrative and it worked, right? And partly because like in the US, the Democratic Party, their narrative and story got worse. They essentially abandoned their constituency and had nothing to say, basically, right? So that the idea of austerity and that you have to, tighten your belts, we can't spend so much. It's very immoral and wrong to be spending so much as a government when we're in debt and we're irresponsible. Now we've got to pay the price, but then it'll get really better because we'll be more free without the state, et cetera, et cetera. Like, not to rehearse that too much, but I think it's a correct point that the place of narrative in the place of knowledge and the production of knowledge are really fundamental to the political world that we end up all having to live in and deal with, right? Okay, anyway, so yeah. The other book I'll talk about was Illiberal China, which was in some ways kind of a sequel to the first one I did on Orientalism in China, but that begins after Tiananmen, right, after '89, begins with the 90s and beyond, right? So looking at the more contemporary moment in China, but also kind of around the world, right? So it's Illiberal China, the ideological challenge of the People's Republic of China, right? And you can see the table of contents here. I won't run through the whole book here. I'll just try to give you some of the highlights and where it maybe dovetails with hopefully some of your interests or some of the questions I've already brought up. So, yeah, that's where we begin. This one begins with the idea you see even more of now. When I first started this, it wasn't used that much. Maybe that's why I got struck by it. But that China is a specifically illiberal regime, right? And it stands opposed to the liberal ones, right? You couldn't really call it a communist threat or communist menace anymore so much, right? It's still the Communist Party, and that still kind of comes up, but it's clearly not the same party or not the same communism as back then, because we're aware of how wealthy China is, how much inequalities it has. You know, everybody in the party wears a business suit or a power suit, and they're all about skyscrapers and da-da-da, right? So it's not that same kind of thing anymore, too. But Elizabeth Perry, who's an excellent scholar of China, historian, a political historian, happened to write an essay called The Illiberal Challenge of Authoritarian China, and basically looked at protest in China and documents how the state actually watches protests very carefully. And when they see a strike or a big protest, this is kind of pre-Xi Jinping era, by the way, too. It's another thing we might have to talk about later. It monitors these things very carefully, and it responds and addresses them, right? It never transforms the regime. It doesn't transform the logic or the kind of lack of electoralness within the party system or something like that. Yeah. So in that sense, it kind of, the protests don't really change the authoritarian nature of the regime in Perry's analysis, right? But that they do actually respond. And so the challenge is that the system kind of works, right? But what was interesting to me as I read this little essay of hers was that, as I put it here, why is this bad, basically, right? So it's definitely this kind of one-party system, right? But if it is kind of responding to protest or strikes or problems or eruptions or criticism, things like that, then it is kind of functioning. And I don't see why that's illiberal, actually. So there was a kind of contradiction there to do that, because illiberal would imply something, either a crackdown or something not paying attention or redressing these kinds of things, right? It's in a way kind of tolerant even, or at least responsive, right? So yeah, that's where I kind of begin that with this, right? Now, so the point of my first book was that there's this new form of Orientalism, the becoming sameness of China, right? What's been interesting is that nobody much believes that so much anymore, right? As China gets more successful economically and more powerful, it's quite clear that the market reforms are not going to lead to democracy in the way that they want it, liberal democracy. It's not going to lead to the end of the Communist Party, or even its particular transformation. Even as China only goes more and more global and expands its economy and integration in the global system more and more, right? So that kind of transformation or becoming sameness never really happened, right? So now it seems like we get a lot of coding of it as being just simply illiberal and stuck somewhere, right? However you want to put it. So I wanted to take that charge kind of seriously and see what sense the criticism of the regime or of the PRC as a system as illiberal, what kind of sense that really makes, okay? And to what sense it is or is not illiberal, right? Yeah. Let's see. I'll skip this part of it here. Genealogy of the word in English, illiberal. Okay. There is a kind of key critique here. Uday Mehta, you may or may not know his work. He's worked on liberalism in colonial India, right? Domenico Losordo is a recent book on liberalism. Anyway, there is a kind of critique of liberalism out there in post-colonial studies as much as in Marxism and in other kind of streams of thought, right? That see it as not a universalism, but as something that is almost by definition based on exclusions, and hierarchies, right? And it was not only a kind of political discourse of democracy that kind of left out workers, right, or the working class, right? But that was a kind of very functional part of colonialism and empire. And I think that after the Cold War, people kind of tended to forget about that. We started forgetting that liberalism used to be seen as really kind of a problem, not as such a great or governing ideology, right? And I think that that does relate even today to the kind of political culture, intellectual political culture of the PRC. It is anti-liberal, right? If you understand illiberal as simply anti-liberal, which is actually its kind of original meaning, right? You get a better approximation of what way the PRC is illiberal. It's anti-liberal, right? Illiberal in that sense. And they will even single it out now, liberalism and universalism, as things that the party intelligentsia and party officials and intellectuals need to be aware of, right? So I have a link here in this document to a communique from actually several years ago now that kind of just named liberalism, universalism as problems that the party needs to be on guard against. Okay. So anyway, the first chapter of the book kind of rehearses this problem with liberalism and illiberalism and some of the terms, right? The other parts of the book have to deal with the rise in the 90s and afterwards of what's called the New Left in China, or basically a kind of heterodox group of intellectuals and writers that could be public, most of them are academic actually, who are either just like regular conventional academics, like historians or something like that, or a bit more like doing criticism, things like that. And they arose first as a response against the previous decades, meaning the 80s in particular, emphasis on liberalism, right? So it's a kind of return of some type of leftism understood as, you know, vaguely socialist or Marxist, critical of the reforms to some extent. This is the risky part of it, right? But critical or wary of the extent of China's globalization. So these were people who would start bringing up again the question of imperialism, or the question of China being, either demonized or kind of pathologized by the world system, how China doesn't fit the kind of Eurocentric narratives, liberalism, stuff like that, right? And critical of some of the reforms and turn to globalization. Did some work on like the Mao era, right? The most famous one, the name you may well know already, of this whole generation is Wang Wei, who's he's an incredibly erudite person. He actually, almost primarily, I would say, would be a kind of historian, intellectual historian of the really early republic, or even the Qing dynasty, right? But who is kind of Marxist or social democratic and has written various things about workers' rights and so on and so forth. So anyway, it's an interesting group of people. A good bit of the stuff is in English, actually, at this point, not a majority of it by any means, but it's out there. Yeah. So that, yeah, they kind of represent, I think, and of course they had, Wang Wei is a little bit, it's become something of a major figure whom everyone knows and respects because people have actually read him, right? But they were very controversial at the time, and they kind of got a rough reception, not only by liberals in China, but by other people abroad, right? So anyway, the New Left kind of remains controversial, put it that way. Yeah. Sometimes disparaged as illiberal, but certainly critics of liberalism. Yeah, to varying degrees. So that's the New Left folks. And I think what they were trying to do is, and are still trying to do with other people, is produce a more China-centered or their own kind of history and accounts of their past and of perspective on the world and on even what China is, right? Not just relying on what on area experts from abroad. So chapter 3 is the chapter on liberalism. I won't rehearse that too much here because I want to leave some time for questions and things like that. But looking at this, the fate of liberalism within China. Okay, it's a huge topic. This is just one kind of chapter and account of it here. But what has happened in China has been something that we've actually seen elsewhere as well, which is a kind of degradation of liberalism in historical perspective. If you look at the May 4th era, you look at the teens and 20s, these kind of iconoclastic liberal intellectuals, some of whom became left-wingers, some who stayed liberals, whatever, but they're not only a different era, but have different kind of politics, I think, than if you compare it to some of the 80s and 90s people up to the present, who are basically drawing much more on like Cold War liberalism. So Friedrich von Hayek is a big influence, right, on the liberal circle, right, that way. So it ends up being about like free markets, right? There's not this anti-imperialist kind of liberalism of the May 4th and 20s, but something that looks almost all too familiar, right? Okay. Then there's 2 chapters here. We can maybe talk about this more. One on Hong Kong, and this was the umbrella movement of 2014. Although I went back a little bit to look at it, the kind of history of the democracy movement, and a little bit going forward as well, right? But this was published before the events of the past year in Hong Kong, from this basically about a year ago, last month of June, almost up until the present. We can talk about that later, actually. I've been obsessed with this. You guys have probably all seen all the reports in media as well. I don't know if it's as big in India and South Asia as it appears to be everywhere else, and certainly big in Hong Kong. The new national security law and all this kind of stuff. So, but this one looks at the fate of liberalism now in Hong Kong, right? And I think it's, as a topic, at least, this is as relevant as it was like a few years ago when I was writing this. Hong Kong's opposition, democratic opposition, or just opposition in general, has always been profoundly liberal. And that is because of what the city is, and that's what its formation always was. As part of the British Empire, it had a kind of British colonial liberalism hardwired into it. Yeah. It's even more hardwired into a kind of free market, laissez-faire liberal economics. And yeah, this is not a good fit. Maybe the economic part could fit, actually, but with the kind of political culture of the mainland, right? Which is now what it basically has to deal with, right? So it was trying to look at the demand for autonomy, the demand for electoral reform in Hong Kong, which was the Occupy movement. It was essentially, in some ways, a tussle over the basic law. Okay, I won't try to rehearse all of this for us here, but basically the kind of mini constitution that's run and set up for the city, that was set up by the British and the mainland with some Hong Kong like democratic and official cooperation in the 80s, right? And so the basic law is an interesting document. It's a very problematic document. I think now, as of today, it's pretty much toast. Like it certainly doesn't mean what Hong Kong opposition has thought it always has meant, which was basically they're going to give us universal suffrage, and we're going to have a lot of autonomy, this high degree of autonomy that's promised from the basic law, right, in Hong Kong, and we're going to be able to elect our own CE. And the basic law does basically promise that. And the mainland made 0 steps towards giving that from 97 up until 2014, which was a large part of what that protest was. The opposition wanted to be able to elect its own chief executive by direct nomination, right? The way it works now, and that's also stipulated in the basic law, is that it has to go through this committee of a few hundred people. I have all the details, I can't remember in my head, who will come up with a few names. Beijing has basically a lot of input on this, and then that committee will pick the person, right? So that's not very democratic, I guess, or it's not much of a broad election, right? So that's what the struggle had been about for so many years, just getting to that. Okay. At the time of Occupy, the other thing that gets quite strong or stronger, not just this question of suffrage and how we're going to vote for the CE, but this desire for autonomy, right? Which has basically been understood as being like, you stay over there, no interference, and other than we admit that China is the ultimate sovereign, we don't want a whole lot to do with you folks, right? Or with your system. We know we're going to get the immigrants. There's going to be a lot of business going on, but we want to keep this at bay. We want this kind of autonomy because we aren't part of China. And to be fair, then they were not. Hong Kong has not been until historically very recently, right? So there's also this tussle over autonomy, which is an interesting construct in some ways, right? And phenomenon and value, right? So anyway, 2014, that's the point. That's the purpose of the Occupy movement, is to occupy that space and demand that suffrage in particular, right? And to uphold the basic law as they see it, right? Now, there's a lot of issues around this because the basic law also contradicts this promise of suffrage, and it also kind of still insists on that committee, and it insists above all on China's sovereignty over Hong Kong. And to say that China has sovereignty over Hong Kong means that it gets to interpret the rules as it wants, ultimately, right? This is kind of sheer question of power, right? So anyway, this was a kind of 2014, and my analysis in the chapter is that it's this kind of confrontation from a very liberal opposition political culture, right, with something which is illiberal, right? And they're just, it makes a meaningful dialogue or compromise very, very difficult. And in fact, there was no compromise after the Occupy movement. The mainland actually, even right before it, had promised a kind of modified version of this election process, right? Basically, they would offer 2 candidates from this special committee to the public to vote on and choose from, and then anybody could vote on them. But they would basically still be picking those candidates through this committee of Hong Kong representatives, right? That was shot down, okay, for better or worse. And it's been at a kind of stagnant impasse, right, with people demanding suffrage and now autonomy more and more. And even now, in the immediate years afterwards, independence or a kind of de facto independence, because if you really insist on full autonomy, that's essentially a form of independence, right? At least in my mind. So it kind of ends up with this kind of stagnant situation. Okay, you can contrast that, as I do in the book, with 2011, just 3 years earlier, a more successful, if not still successful enough, protest movement up in Wuhan, which is a village outside, a village of like, several thousand people, but outside of a town called Lufeng up in Guangdong still, okay? And I don't know if you all saw this, there were some great videos on it that were on, I think they're probably still on, the Al Jazeera website, made by, I'm sorry, I forget their name, a couple of Singapore-based documentary people who kind of were there for whatever reason and ended up having a lot of great video on this to the extent that videos and documentaries can help us understand this stuff, which I sometimes wonder. But basically, this was a protest that arose over land seizures by local officials. So what happened in Wuhan is something that's happened elsewhere, where local party officials basically sell land out from under people who have a claim to it and don't tell them about it or don't compensate them. It's just theft. There's no other word for it, right? So this had been happening, and then some protests happened in response, and these were really quite militant, and that the protesters took over the entire town, kind of forced the police back, so on and so forth. But the interesting thing about this was twofold, right? Not just that it worked, but that there was no crackdown from above, right? And one major reason why there was not such a crackdown was because the protesters knew enough not to spin this in a human rights, liberal opposition kind of way around individual liberties, or was not a liberal kind of protest, if I can put it that way, that you would see in Hong Kong 3 years later, okay? They either strategically or authentically, I have no idea, we have no real idea, they were quite clear that they were not against the Communist Party and that they wanted the party to come down to the village, clean up the local officials, and restore this and do justice, right? So there's a long tradition of this kind of logic or form of protest within China, and that's the one that they were basically actualizing. And it was, at least in comparison to Hong Kong, more successful in the sense of getting redress, right? They actually got those officials who took the land in jail or otherwise deposed from their jobs, right? They had new local elections. The protest leaders actually were voted in, all right? So it seems like your ideal democratic moment, and it was very exciting and talked about as such at the time in 2011, right? You have a protest, it's militant, and you not only depose the bad officials, you get to take their place, right? Now it goes on that some of these other people were later arrested for embezzling or taking too much of the money, and it didn't end great, right? I'll give you the quick version of this here. But some redress was made, right? Both in terms of the land and in terms of the money. And then the state went in and basically built new buildings and offered some more welfare and help for the village of Wukan, right? So as a kind of electoral or democratic movement, it was far more successful than the Hong Kong one. Of course, it's smaller, right? But I think it had lessons there, which was basically to not demonize the party, but to try to use it strategically to get what you want. Yeah. The other thing that the villagers in Wukan did was have enough media savvy to distance themselves rhetorically, discursively, or in terms of their narrative from the foreign media. So when the Hong Kong media, which counts as foreign media in this case, when they're there, when Al Jazeera there and other non-mainland media are there, they say, look, we're not interested in overthrowing the party. We're not interested in this and that. We like the Communist Party. We love the Communist Party. We want them to come and take care of this and that kind of stuff, right? They quite pointedly and consciously said this to the foreign media. And I think that made a huge difference because it allows the domestic media, it allows the party people at the county, province level and above to take action, right? So I think this kind of thing is the future, basically, for Hong Kong. It's going to not have to do the exact same thing necessarily, but it's going to have to figure out how to appeal to the party, right? I mean, it's got to have to change its rhetoric. Now, I'm saying this, and I'm even laughing to myself because we're not seeing any of that like in this past year, or even more recently now with the National Security Act, things like that, right? And so I think my friends who are much more gung-ho with the chances of the opposition in Hong Kong, things like that, would I don't know, smirk at me or whatever. But I think that's the only way forward, basically, in the future in some ways, right? That you have to change the tactics and change the kind of narrative and basically unlearn some of the kind of liberal discourse that you always draw on to try to get what you want in opposition to either the Hong Kong government or the mainland government. So, yeah, I tell you what, I don't want to, I can wrap up a little bit here, but basically what I'm trying to do in this book too is examine, not just examine the liberalism or illiberalism of China and what's at stake there, but kind of call into question the universality of liberal discourse for politics in general, right? Particularly when that liberal discourse has been degraded so badly within China, within Hong Kong, within the world in general, right? And that the Chinese system does kind of present a challenge to that ideologically for us to think through, right? If liberalism has been kind of degraded and reached a kind of historical endpoint, or at least pause, or a certain limit to it now, what is going to come next, right? What I haven't emphasized here in the presentation today on this is, if there's one positive thing to take away from the PRC's illiberalism, I think it would be what's called the, put it here in this paragraph, I'll just put your attention to it, the question of statism, right? That there is a kind of commitment to the state as the terrain of politics, okay? So I see the New Left people, of course, assuming that. But even the villagers up in Wuhan were kind of operating from that as well, right? That politics has to be about the state and a struggle for the state at the end of the day, that's the terrain of the political. Now, the Chinese state and the party has got a very strong claim on it, doesn't want to give it up, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that this problem, the problem of the state, the fact that our states have become so weakened and so captured by, you know, oligarchies and kind of economic interests, right? That it's really a problem now to turn that back and go after it, so to speak. But I think that that's basically going to have to be the way forward. So I feel like that might be at least one thing to think of through China. Like it's not given up in its political culture, oppositional or mainstream, however you want to put it, official or unofficial. Okay, it hasn't given up on that understanding of the state or politics as being about the state, right? So I think that that's something that's going to be on the agenda, basically, and I think that it's going to be something that we see. I won't go into all this stuff around Hong Kong now, but I think in Hong Kong that's going to basically also be on the agenda now too, right? There'll be a slowing, better appreciation of the fact that you're not going to get suffrage in the way that you want it. You might be able to get some of those reforms back at some point around the electoral process, right? But there's no reason to limit all of your politics, which has been the case up until recently, okay, to that question. You can start making claims on the state. One of the things that's really plagued Hong Kong has been its hierarchies, its inequalities, and its loss of state capacity, yeah? Its political elites have done such a lousy job of taking care of their people and producing livelihood, right? That the time is ripe for a kind of opposition movement, an intellectual movement, to start making demands on the state as a state, not just for elections, but for essentially welfare, social democracy, housing, this kinds of stuff, right? I think that stuff is still political. So I'm hoping that when all this kind of dust settles and Hong Kong gets back to normal, that will come more and more on the agenda of people and also of the government and officials, right? So I think that insofar as this represents a pushback against liberalism, we have a critique of liberalism coming now, but hopefully from a more kind of progressive or inclusive direction than we've seen. Okay. Yeah. All right. I think I should wrap up here now. Yeah. Yeah. So thanks. I think I'm happy to speak more to any of these things in discussion. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Are you getting my voice? Is my voice clear?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, for your talk and for explaining for us your two books and how they are, what they are covering exactly. So now I am seeing that our participants have started to write down their questions. So we'll start our Q&A section. And I will start by a question of my question at first.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so my question is about how the Communist Party guided China to success, and if we are seeing socialism in other stories, in other countries of the world, it didn't succeed like it has succeeded in China. So why it has socialism has been accepted in China and it has worked in China and has been rejected elsewhere in other countries like after World II in India and UK.
Okay. Oh, that's great. Let me just jot down one thing here.
Yeah, you can please end that to share your screen in order to see you well, Professor.
Oh, sorry, you can't see me?
We are seeing
okay,
you,
okay.
but you close it.
I'll stop sharing.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I got it. It's a very simple interface, actually. I got this one out. Okay, so that's great. That's a good question, actually. I mean, why is it that, you know, the Soviet Union lasted, what, 80 years? No, 17. Well, they're actually coming up close to about the same kind of time frame, but I think that, yeah, it's a good question. One of the first questions is, what is socialism, right? So a lot of people would dispute that China is socialist because of its inequalities and because of its private capital and so on and so forth. And clearly there's a very good point there. But my question on Chinese socialism is this, like, it's not the socialism of the Mao period, right? It's not the socialism of like a European Democratic Party or Bernie Sanders in the United States or something like that. It's not. Yeah. But I think that if it calls itself socialism, we still have to take that seriously because that's its self-understanding. It's not just sheer propaganda or meaningless to the people in China, meaning specifically, okay, not all the people of China, for God's sake, but the people in the party and other people who use that word and have that as an understanding, which in some ways might just mean a single party system that's legitimate, right? There is, they're on the brink of, they're always a site of struggle, but there is a state-owned enterprise system, right? There is some
I think there is
even if it's partly for profit and privatized things like that. There was never a liberal moment, right? There wasn't this liberal multi-party democracy movement that, right? And that all its neighbors had, and that China really wanted it or something like that. So that's not really been kind of available discourse by and large for people to get all that concerned with. They know what it is. They live in the world. They know that there's many such regimes in Europe and even in Japan and India for that matter, right? They know that, right? But it's not this operative, really powerful thing, okay, for that reason. I think, you know, so it has its own traditions, basically. That too. They've been successful. I mean, I think that they have been able to survive and endure partly because they are extremely adaptable. So Elizabeth Perry co-wrote a book with a German scholar, I think Sebastian Hielman, if I have his name correct. It was something like the invisible hand of Mao or something like that, right? But how this kind of extremely adaptable state and system that comes out of the Maoist guerrilla era is still there. So it's very adaptable to its circumstances and crises, right? It's not really this ossified structure that's just going to go like that. As you see with the COVID crisis, which is very much a crisis, it's adaptable, it will respond, it kind of keeps going. It's not this perfect, well-oiled machine by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a functional one, right? So I think that in some ways they still have kind of built and kept a certain state capacity to do stuff and get stuff done, right? Its legitimacy has gone through different stages, right? The revolutionary legitimacy was powerful, right? But of course it's in the 30s and 40s, yeah? Maoism has had such a bad rap, and there were, major failures that were quite costly, but there were also major achievements on like literacy, liberation of women, life expectancy, these kind of things too, that it had, right? But the fact that they settled and won a civil war, kicked out the Japanese, and kind of retained the borders of that last Chinese empire, all gave them a certain legitimacy that could last for some time, right? As well as the kind of charismatic authority of Mao, etc. And then after that, I mean, it shifts so powerfully in another direction, economically and politically, but it also works to some extent. Now it's not, and again, I'm not cheerleading this, but there's no question that there has been a massive economic revolution or second revolution or counter revolution, however you want to put it, that has happened in China. So a lot of people's lives have, I hesitate to say they've gotten better, but basically they've gotten better. We can say that, right? I mean, there's a lot of people been lifted out of poverty. They've basically inserted China into this kind of capitalist consumer global modernity, and enough people like it, right? They've basically, I don't particularly like this, and personally in some ways, they've been successful at depoliticizing the society, partly through consumerism, partly through just having peace and prosperity, right? So, I think that's why it's been able to endure and stick around, right? Now, of course, not everybody feels the same way, right? But clearly enough people do, so that it has a certain legitimacy from its performance, and it has a certain kind of undeniable success, yeah, I would say. So, and that will be called socialism, right? It's the people like my old colleagues or buddies back in the States and things like that, or around the world, who want to say, look, socialism means what Karl Marx said, or socialism means the high point of German social democracy. And I think those are all great things. The Marxist thing, however, is just purely ideational. It exists on a page somewhere. You know what I mean? So they're actually, how do I put it? What's the way to put this actually? The orthodox ones, I could put it this way, are actually the Chinese. They're the official socialists, because that's what socialism has been, right? All the other things are the little kind of sects or heterodoxies or ideas or something like that, yeah? So at some level, I think we have to deal with the fact that socialism is what it is what exists in China, because that's how they understand it and practice it, yeah? We don't have to like it. We can say, well, look, it's highly unequal. How could it be socialist? You can have your criticisms, right? But I don't think you can say that that's just like false consciousness or fake, right? That's a long answer to that, but I think it's a really good question.
Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have lots of questions from our participants as well. Otarsh Rai is one of our intern. He is asking, would China be an example of what we refer to state capitalism?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, if you take it, I like the state capitalism. Yeah, basically, I mean, you could call that, you could, but they would call it socialism, right? So it's certainly, I think you can call it, I mean, you can make a pretty clear case or argument that it's kind of a state capitalist, right? But it depends on what you make of that, because it's, you know, capitalism has, why, if it is useful, state capitalism would be a useful phrase, because it would first of all tell us that there are varieties of capitalism, right? And there's like a whole sociological literature on that, of varieties of capitalism. It's not always just this one thing, right? And I think that some forms might be better than others, or more effective at some things, and that kind of thing. So you could say that. I think so. If you mean it as a criticism, then you need to, which is a fine thing to do too, right? Because the exploitation and all that kind of stuff that's going on there is undeniable, but you have to be kind of specific about what the criticisms are, right? And the other point is that, of course, capitalism always has a state. Even neoliberalism and this austerity economics that have been forced on the world for 30 years, that requires a strong state to institute it, right? So that's, yeah, thank you. I can see the chat box, yeah.
Would like, I can help you in reading the questions. Satish is saying, how far is the national security law passed in Hong Kong legal?
Oh, how is it legal?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, I'm still trying to get my head around it. I've been distracted all day, and then since yesterday was a holiday, and I've got kids, I'm with them all the time, that kind of stuff, so I'm trying to digest it more today. It actually is legal in the sense that, at least my understanding of it, I have to go back and look at this even more, but I had read things like last week or even the week before saying that they do have the legal authority to do this, in the sense that, and I forget exactly why, right? But there was opinion for that. And the basic law does stipulate that Hong Kong has to pass this Article 23, basically national security legislation, right? It says you got to do that, and it says we also have to give you universal suffrage in some form. Neither thing have happened, right? So the opposition has always wanted to give us the suffrage, and the mainland's always been like, give us the national security law, right? No movement on either direction. And then the protests erupt last year. And I've written on this, my own take on it. If people are interested, you can look it up, or I can send it to you. But how it started in June and how it ended in September and August, September, October, November are very different things. So I think that one thing is that the movement really changed. And by the end of it, it got really kind of violent and almost nihilistic. And I don't think it ended well, actually. I think it's been a tragic event for Hong Kong in many ways, right? Because a lot of people made mistakes doing this, right? I mean, all the sides have kind of had their own failures. And I'd not to leave off the establishment by any case, because in some ways they're even more responsible. They are more responsible, right? But anyway, is it legal? Yeah, because if it says that this is the basic law, it does, that China and the party have sovereignty, and that they can interpret the basic law in certain cases as they wish through the National People's Congress, right? So that they have this kind of wiggle room and escape clauses in there to do this, yeah? And what they've done is just bypassed the local legislature entirely. So the basic law asks them, Article 23 says, a national security law has to be enacted and passed by Hong Kong, meaning that it has to be done within Hong Kong, by Hong Kong people, representatives, et cetera, et cetera. You all have to do this, right? but we can still, in questions of Hong Kong sovereignty or China's sovereignty over Hong Kong, we can still intervene and do this, basically, right? So I think that because of the kind of violence and riots and how it ended up, and especially by the fact that some of the young activists from the Occupy, post-Occupy years, like Joshua Wong, you've all seen that kind of stuff, the fact that they were able to go to the United States and enlist the United States Congress and the president in the struggle over Hong Kong meant that this was going to happen, so that they were not going to wait any longer for Hong Kong to pass this kind of National Security Act. They were just going to do it and append it to the end of the document, right? So I think strictly speaking, it's legal, but it's clearly something that's going to and already has made a lot of people unhappy, because it looks like an abrogation of that basic law document, right? Yeah. They can argue that it's still legal, put it that way.
Aru is having a long question, so I'm asking you, Aru, please to ask your question by yourself to Professor Daniel.
Sure.
So please open your mic and ask the question, Aru. It will be easier for both of us if you ask your questions by yourself.
Yeah.
Ashima, you do have you have raised your hand. You wanna ask a question? Okay, so Aru, write your question to be more simplified. So Ashima is saying, what are the ramifications for Hong Kong of China's action?
Oh, I see. Well, I mean, I've been looking at, following the media, social media, trying to figure out what's going on today. And people are upset, right? So, I think that, everyone's saying this is the death of Hong Kong or the end of Hong Kong, right? And they're saying the basic laws. I've been saying the basic law is over, but also because I'm reading like Professor Lloyd Tai Lok in Hong Kong has written really amazing stuff on Hong Kong in general, but his analysis of the basic law coming out of the 80s when China was still socialist more, had a different economic system, promising autonomy from Hong Kong. Well, that's kind of easy to imagine because the Chinese capitalism, Chinese socialism or capitalism, whatever you want to call it in the 80s, very different than it is now. Hong Kong's still always been capitalist, free market, classical, laissez-faire capitalist place, right? You can see it might be possible to kind of keep them separate because they really are different systems. But now they're not, right? They're really closely integrated. And actually, a lot of the Hong Kong rich and the Hong Kong elite moved all their money there, right? And basically cut out the bottom, or eviscerated the Hong Kong economy for working people by moving everything to the north. So they're not separate anymore. So yeah, I think that they will keep this basic law constitution system on paper until 2047 at least, maybe even longer. That's when it's supposed to be expired. But it will be interpreted differently. There's always been the kind of Hong Kong interpretation emphasizing suffrage, and then the mainland interpretation saying, boy, you guys are already so autonomous. And they are actually in some ways. We are. But you got to have the security law, et cetera, et cetera. So I think obviously their interpretation would go that way. The ramification is we don't really quite know yet. So there were huge protests, not huge actually. There was a huge amount of arrests. There was 370 people arrested, I think, yesterday, something like that. And 10 of them were charged initially with national security law violations, right? But now we don't know how those will play out. One person, I think, was 15, a young woman. And I suspect because she's 15, if you express contrition or something like that, you can usually get a reduced sentence from what I understand, right? If you're willing to do that. So we'll see how those sentences go. I mean, I think that it was actually still, compared to last summer, a much smaller protest. And Hong Kong had been really kind of quiet, partly because of the virus. And I think people are burnt out on the protests. I think a lot of people are scared of what might happen. I think there's also, understandably, I guess, I think there's also a great deal of panic and moral panic around this, because they think that they're all going to be, we think they're going to snatch people off the streets. And it's a kind of vague enough law, as these laws tend to be, that it's really going to depend on how they enforce it and interpret it and put it into work within Hong Kong, right? If it's really like waving a banner will get you arrested, then there's going to be trouble. But I don't think, I hope not, that it will be quite that draconian, right? So it's almost too soon to tell. But I think that it will certainly be a changing point for Hong Kong. I think the protests last summer and the way that they ended, the kind of denouement of them, the fire bombs, the violence from the police, the attacks on the police, really changed things. And again, particularly bringing the United States and even Britain, too, the rest of the world, bringing that into play and making this, as they intended to do, a global problem for Xi Jinping and the party is what precipitated this, right? So I really feel like that was basically the changing point. So they just can't, they're not going to allow that, basically. So yeah, I think that's going to be a change. Now, to what extent this will really be promulgated and enforced, we don't quite know yet, right? So I'm hoping it'll be softer, obviously. Yeah. I don't personally, that Hong Kong would have a national security law makes sense, right? I mean, all states do. So it's gonna be on the details of it, right? And how they enforce it. You know, one thing they just put in there, there's a couple things that I will mention that I personally don't like, and I'm much more sympathetic to mainland claims over Hong Kong. I mean, my whole point of my analysis has been like, Hong Kong needs to change its politics to direct it towards a kind of integration with the mainland, a politics of integration with the mainland, as opposed to an autonomy and this hands off and back off and I hate you, go away, right? Even though I think people should have the right to say, I hate you, go away, right? So I'm like on the fringe saying that, basically, compared to many people, right? But there was an article, I think 83 in the new proposed law, a lot of people are talking about, they have this thing that the Americans have too, which is an extraterritoriality, which says that basically, if you commit a law, you break a law of Hong Kong and you're abroad, even if you're not a Hong Kong resident, you're still breaking the law, right? But the way that it's being talked about already is that, oh, they're going to go out and just start nabbing people all over the world, right? And they've basically said that, well, we could if we want to, if we had to, kind of thing, right? So I don't like this, right? I think extraterritorial kind of seizure and extraditions is bad news, right? I don't think they can really do it, or they can't do it much, right? So I don't want to have an undue panic about it, but I don't like that. And the independence thing in Hong Kong, actually, this is really worth saying. Nobody really, there are very, very few people in Hong Kong who believe that Hong Kong should be independent or that it could be independent. I mean, everybody's kind of realistic that it can't be, right? So it's actually a minority opinion. It's not that big a deal. But now they've made it into one. Both some of this opposition and the kind of global media and machinery around it have made Hong Kong independence into this big thing, right? But it's actually, and now we have a law banning it. And that's not advisable, basically. I mean, I'm not surprised. And part of it can say, well, okay, well, people don't really want it anyway. But I do think that it makes more sense to allow people to voice their views, right? Rather than just squash it. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. It's really a wait and see approach, I think, for a lot of us right now, seeing what's going on. But I think that there'll be no real reason to panic. I think it seems really harsh now. It'll be harsh for some people. Some people will definitely lose, right? So other people will gain, right? But Hong Kong's not going to die, I don't think. I mean, people have been predicting the death of Hong Kong since the 1970s, from what I understand, right? When it became evident that it was going back at some point, right? So it's not going to. It'll change. It'll keep changing, but it's going to be here, right? So we will see.
Another question is from Sirat. Sirat is saying, is China really dedicated to socialism and believes in Marxism, Leninism, and Maoist thought, or is China using them to just serve its own political agendas? How to term this?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you give that one again?
Yeah, she's saying, is China really dedicated to socialism and believes in Marxism, Leninism, and Maoist thought, or China is just using them to serve its own political agenda? How to term this?
Yeah, that's a good question too. I think, actually I don't think I know, there are people in the party and there are intellectuals, some academics, some other people who really do think that China is socialist in some sense and will become more so, or could become more so, or this is the thing. So put it this way, there are people who buy into that. Yeah. I think certainly within the party, they understand it in their own way, but I think that it's sincere or legit to them, right? I think there are also plenty of people who think that that's a really empty word at best, right? And there'll be people who think it's basically just an alibi and it's BS or something like that, right? What's interesting to me, to go back to the first question, why is the party still, why does it have socialism for so long? Why is it still sticking along? I think because people really do, people in power, people in the party and influential positions like that, they still buy into it, right? So it's not a case where they're just cynical, right? I think there are probably plenty of cynical people, right? The amount of corruption that's probably still there, and that Xi Jinping kind of made his mark with eliminating or trying to eliminate, right, tells you that there's a whole lot of people that have to be quite cynical at best, right, or cynical or quite thoughtless at best, that somehow you could be socialist but then stealing all this money, basically, like kind of bribes and things like that. So it's not, yeah. So I think it's a complicated question, and there's probably a range of opinion on that. But I think, some people do take it, or dedicated to it, or take it seriously, right? What that means, I don't know. I mean, it means essentially one party, some sense of livelihood. Yeah.
Another question is from Nancy Nabil. She's saying, do you think China, with its social ideology, will have the supreme power in the international system after the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially after what is taking place in USA in terms of protests and so on? So what do you think about the future of China?
This is really interesting. Yeah. It's a good question, and I think a lot of people are trying to think about this right now. I mean, so you have a great rise in China bashing, of course, in the U.S. and Donald Trump and the kind of like racist China bashing, or the Chinese flu and so on and so forth, and that they've done this, and like President Trump is basically blaming China for him losing the election already, right? and it might actually be the case in some ways, quite honestly, that he will lose the election because of the virus, not because it was a plan from Beijing or something like that. We're going to see how it plays out. So there's been this rise of a kind of anti-China sentiment in many places. I think other places have seen that it's handled it effectively or more effectively than other places, right? So certainly anyone who's a third country or a disinterested observer looking at this and compares the response in the United States to the COVID pandemic, and the response in China, China comes off well in that comparison, right? So does Taiwan, right, actually. So does Vietnam, I think. Hong Kong comes off well. Other places come off well, right, for doing it. So what's China going to be like post-COVID? Well, in terms of its like soft power influence abroad, I could see how it might actually go up, actually, at least in some cases, right? But maybe not in the States, maybe not in other places. I think the US right now has so many crises that have to do with its kind of economic austerity really since the 80s, political economy of the country since the 1980s. So yeah, the current President Trump is definitely a part of this decline and chaos and troubles in there, but also go back to that, right? It has, I don't know, but this, I mean, the question, I don't think China, if this was part of it, I don't think China is really seeking to be this global hegemon, right? I think sometimes it does want to. It's an interesting question, right? I don't really think it's capable of it because it has so many of its own problems and issues, right? That it's going to see itself as being really a rival or enemy of the United States. I think the question will be who can recover from this huge impact on their national economies and the impact on the global economy better, right? And the United States is in a bad position because it basically doesn't have the money, from what I understand, or the capacity to really slow down, but it's having to slow down, right? And then it keeps trying to open up too early, and now more people are getting sick. It's not handling it well at all, right? And they're not willing to take that hit economically. Whereas China's been like, yeah, we're going to take a huge hit economically, right? Hong Kong's taking a hit economically. I think India must be taking one as well, right? So it's going to be the places which are going to be able to accept that and respond to it will go forward, right? But I think the hope is not all lost for the United States either. I mean, it has certain advantages. It has the dollar, which isn't going to go away. I'm hoping that the Black Lives Matter and all the response to that will change something in the US now. I mean, I think that it has been totally remarkable to see this, right? To see Confederate statues being torn down, right? To see Woodrow Wilson's name removed from Princeton's School of Foreign Policy, this kind of stuff, right? That maybe there will be a reckoning with their own history of racism and violence and desperation and things like that, right? I hope that it will be reaching a kind of bottoming out in some ways of all the stuff that's brought it to this crisis and a kind of reckoning with that. Because I think that there's potential there, actually. It's because the Black Lives Matter thing has been so popular, right? It has spread around the country. There are a lot of people who are horrified by the police violence, right? There's been a pushback strongly against the All Lives Matter people, right? So I think that this is good, and I hope it keeps going forward because I think that that can make a difference. It's just that it kind of goes back to what I was saying with beginning of this, like really there's these political crises, right? And the stories and the kind of political forms that we have now, right? are really in crisis, so that the party system in the United States has got to finally shift, I think. I don't know. My fear, go back to that, is the Democrats win, but they don't really change anything. There has to be a kind of reorientation within the political system of the US, economically and politically, right? They got to drop the China stuff. They can criticize China all they want, right? But China's not really the problem in the United States, right? Hong Kong's problems are much more China in some way. China's responsible for those because it's part of China now. But it also has to do with Hong Kong's political system and the failure of its political establishment to do anything. So its attention does not need to be on the US, it needs to be on itself and also on the liaison office in China, basically, right? So I think that happens, maybe that'll be good, right? But in terms of who's going to come out of COVID, I think there might be, from what I'm reading and talking to people, it might be like, there might not be a vaccine, right? You can't count on that. So they're going to have to figure out, the whole world actually, we all have to now figure out how to have a functional economy, right? And still have this battle or front against the pandemic, right? I don't think you can go back to the way things were. Maybe we'll learn we need less. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Another question is from Navdeep. He's saying, can China follow a Wuhan strategy of electoral process for Hong Kong?
Well, what I tried to argue, I don't know who's going to listen to me. They don't have to listen. What I tried to argue in that Wuhan chapter was that there is a lesson there for Hong Kong's politics in some ways, right? That you need to, what the villagers did effectively was they kind of triangulated all the global media, right? So they had to be able to spin their message to this global media saying, no, this is not what we're doing. We're not against the Communist Party. We want this, right? So, you know, this, don't get us in trouble, but don't misrepresent us, right? Because I think that they knew that would not play well up above, right? They were kind of professing a certain kind of loyalty or a certain kind of, well, depending how you want to put it, distance between themselves and that. Whereas the Hong Kong response to the global media has been the opposite. It's been like, embrace us, get me to the Congress, get me to wherever, tell our story, you know, join me on Twitter and denouncing the Communist Party or something like that. So I think that they'll have to try to figure out a way to be a bit more strategic, I think, about that. You could see, I mean, in theory, you can see something like Wuhan happening. I mean, but in the sense of, how do you do it? Of course, they've been demanding elections, right? I think that there might be room for maneuver there, basically. Like I said, talking with the media, talking with the government, or talking with the liaison office, rather than something that's so confrontational, try to be a little bit more tactical, basically, in terms of appealing to them or what they can do for them, right? I mean, Hong Kong needs an economy, a much better, more functional, and more social economy, yeah? It's not going to get it from its own political elite and establishment, right? The pan-Democrats traditionally have been very weak on this too, because they're so focused just on the suffrage question and autonomy, right? But if Hong Kong's economy wants to develop or get stronger, it doesn't want autonomy from China. It wants more integration with China. So I think they need to get in the game, basically, right? And maybe the same thing would apply politically, right? And I think that's going to be the way forward, right, tactically. So the Wuhan specifically would not map onto to Hong Kong like, well, seize the streets and then demand the party to come, and that won't quite work, and it's not realistic to ask for that. But I think that from their orientation and a kind of tactical perspective that the villagers seem to have, rejecting human rights liberal thing, which they could have said, there might be something in there to think through.
We have a couple of other questions. Aru is asking, how is it possible for a communistic regime to remain associated with political communism by following liberal market policies?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's in some ways the question I'm trying to put in the book. I think it needs to think through its relationship to liberalism more, right? Because it's essentially followed not quite neoliberal, but liberal economism, as I put it in the book, far too much, right? So that it's bet on growth, wealth, market expansion to drive the growth and to drive the wealth, right? To basically take care of everything. So you try to reduce everything to the market or its economic performance legitimacy, as they would put it, right? And that's reaching its limits, I think. And now maybe with the COVID crisis, those limits might become much more real because the economy is definitely going to contract. They're saying it's only going to grow 1% this year at best. And they usually get like 6-8% goals or more, right? So I think long term, it's not really possible, right? You could have, I suppose, a single party and liberal market policies for some time. I don't think it can be communism, or even socialism might be the better word for that, right? Except for socialism being essentially understood as a one-party system with some sense of responsibility for people's livelihood, something like that. But I think long-term it can. I think short-term it has been able to strike that balance by just people getting more money and occupying themselves with that, right? But long-term, I think that will run into limits. Maybe even now it's hitting limits. Yeah, any other questions? Oh, sorry, I'm not getting any audio. Oops.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Otar. So he's asking, Chinese diplomats have become quite aggressive in their conduct in other countries during the COVID-19 pandemic. Is this an indication of increasing nationalism within China from the public, or is this the Chinese regime trying to deflect attention from the COVID-19 pandemic and its resultant effects on the Chinese economy?
That's a good question too. There's an interesting report in the South China Post, long article.
Please, Ju, close your camera. I'm sorry, Professor.
That's right. Yeah, so the diplomats, I think, it's a question with that. They have become quite more aggressive, actually, even in recent years before this. I forget his name now. I don't think he's there anymore. The one foreign minister from a few years ago was in Canada, and some reporters asked him some questions, and he got really angry and started ripping into the reporter. I was like, wow. Yeah, I think that from what I understand, that they've been telling people to back off from that. They call them like tiger wolf or tiger diplomats and kind of stuff like doing that. And I think there's been some instruction for them to back off a bit. I think that nationalism is all over the place. I think that there's a variety of nationalisms in China, official, unofficial, patriotic, anti-imperialist, chauvinist, sinocentric. I mean, there's a whole gamut of them, and it's definitely been on the rise. And it's a problem, actually. I think that if the regime, if the party or educational propaganda people are smart, they'll try to push back on this in some ways, right? They probably are. I mean, I think that if they're doing that, that will certainly distract people from the COVID epidemic in China, from the economic difficulties in China now, which they still have. I mean, they are still shut down to some extent, right? And they're just slowly opening up airports, okay? So it's not like over there by any case, all right? And they're wary of a second wave happening and things like that. So it would certainly, nationalism is always such a tool to distract people's discontent. I mean, it's happening in the US probably as I speak. I'm sure it's happening in China, it's happening in other places, right? So yeah, I think that's always a deflective thing in that way too. But I would just add that the nationalism in China is pretty varied, and it's not just coming from the top, for better or worse.
Yes. One last question is from Sudhanva. She's saying it is speculated that China uses a process of economic dumping in other countries and uses revenue raised through this process to fund military operations in other countries. So she's asking you, do you think by far this process has worked out for China and it's their biggest tactic, and how can it be countered by other countries?
Yeah, I'm not aware of this happening. I'm not disputing it, right? Economic dumping and funding ops, particularly probably on its borders, and particularly around the Belt and Road expansion and things like that, which I imagine is somewhat on hold now with this global pandemic, right? I'm sure it's still trying to go forward with that, but I'm sure it's probably been slowed down. I mean, I guess, so I don't know. I'm not denying any of it. But I think it's basically this. I mean, I think that China acting in the global economic system acts like a businessman. It's a capitalist entity. So, because it's a capitalist global system. So what they're doing in Africa, or what they're doing in Sri Lanka, or what they're doing anywhere else, they are doing out of their own economic interest. That's, I don't even think they would necessarily deny that, right? This is not philanthropy, right? So it can only be countered or dealt with or negotiated in the same kind of ways, right? If you can. Now, as China gets more powerful, maybe it's harder to say no or harder to negotiate that, but but their success, I won't claim to really know this area, but I read colleagues who work on like China and Africa and debt traps, or supposed debt traps, and how they're not debt traps, or maybe they are, like this whole thing, right? I mean, but clearly they've been successful by offering better terms than the US had traditionally compared to the IMF. And they're not asking, they're not going into a country in Africa, or they're not going to Sri Lanka or somewhere saying, okay, look, you got to restructure your whole economy and do this, right? They're saying, no, they're going to work out this specific thing, right? Now, yeah, so I think that that's what they've done, but it is a competitive and, you know, profit-based system out there. So if they are dumping or doing whatever, I mean, I think that other countries have to be smart enough and savvy enough to push back where they need to push back. And you just have to hope that the political elites or economic elites making all these kind of decisions can be monitored, can be pushed back, can have feedback from people whose lives matter, and from states that are supposed to also be taking care of their own, like laborers and things like that too. Yeah, so that's how you counter it. There's no secret recipe or any, you should counter it the same way you would do anybody else. If you can't, then that's another problem.
Actually, we do have one more question if your time
Sure.
can accept one. Okay, so there is one more question is saying, do you think the Communist Party in China made a strategic, it is regarding Hong Kong, has made a strategic mistake by not doing more to break the monopoly that Hong Kong tycoons had over the system there, which arguably is more responsible for the mess in Hong Kong today?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's well put. I mean, I think the basic law was a mistake. No, I'm saying that from the hindsight of many years, right? I think it was worked out as these kind of treaties are, right? Part of the tragedy of this is like Hong Kong did not have a decolonial movement. It did not have an independence movement, except for a brief kind of anti-British thing during the 60s when the Cultural Revolution was kicking up a storm across the border. You had that kind of moment here. And it had some labor struggles and things like that too, but that's a little bit different, right? So it never went through, I've been meaning to try to write this out somehow, right? To go back to post-colonial studies. There is no recipe or formula for decolonization. But I think if you look at it somewhat historically, the way this goes is you have a movement for sovereignty and national liberation, and you go through this whole process, and then you realize, well, damn, that didn't work. We didn't decolonize this, or we didn't decolonize that, or whatever. But you had a certain process of learning, right? You had a certain kind of cultural moment as well of both a desire for a return to the roots or the native or whatever, but then realizing the limits of that too, or like there's supposed to be a kind of process, I think. And Hong Kong never had that process until now, right? So that's what it's going through, where it's working out its relationship, not with the British, but with the mainland. And the mainland's like, you guys have autonomy, like, why are you picking on us? You know, this kind of stuff, right? So they're a bit flummoxed, I think, by this. And I hope they kind of get up to speed on it. So I think that the basic law, as an expedient document to smooth over a transition, successful. As a blueprint for decolonization or integration into the mainland, a disaster, basically, because you have a capitalist relationship, economic integration happening. That's going to have effects on everything else, right? Yeah. So the promise of autonomy, I think, was not a good idea. Even though they probably had to do it, they kind of did it so they would smooth over things, right? But Hong Kong cannot be autonomous, right? Because it's so small. It's powerful and influential and has a big finance capital thing, but it's really small, right? And it presented this thing. It's an oddly colonial document, right? So one of the colonial cliches about Hong Kong was that it's always been living on borrowed time under the British, right? Because they knew the Brits had to go in '97, so it was always on borrowed time. Wasn't going to be forever. But then they get this basic law deferment of integration with no plan, right? For another 50 years, and that's also more borrowed time, right? But now basically, partly because of the protests 2019, partly just because this relationship is economically going to get tighter, right? That borrowed time has been shortened, basically, yeah. But, vis-a-vis the tycoons, yes, that was not a wise move. But that, I think, was very Deng Xiaoping, right? They enlisted all the support of the tycoons, thinking that would somehow have a magical effect and win the people over as well, or something like that, right? They did that because those folks were patriotic, or they thought they were patriotic. They had no other program for trying to win over hearts and minds among ordinary people, and they're paying the price for that now.
So actually, we do have one more last question, and
okay.
It is what can be China's new policy intervention related to India?
I wish I knew more, quite honestly, and I wish I knew more about the border conflict right now up in the mountains that you all must be thinking about. So I really don't know much about it. I hope it.
Yes, this is what I have. Yes. That's why I didn't ask this question, Juhi. Yeah, because it is not in the Fox. Okay, so thank you, Professor. So we'll stop because it is already we are done in our 2 hours, and it is much more. So you were generous with us in answering all these questions, and we have made you exhausted.
Yeah.
Yes, I can feel your position right now. So at the end of this session, really would like to thank you for all your thought-provoking and in-depth enlightening talk, and that enriched discussions that you have with our participant today. So on behalf of Jindal Center for the Global South, I owe you personally a special vote of thanks for accepting our invitation today. We really appreciate that you have accepted this, and we look forward for more collaboration between us in the future. So this is so we really appreciate all your efforts with us today, Professor Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah.
We really had a fruitful discussion today. Thank you so much. And thank you for all participants.
Okay. Yeah, thank you all.
Who have participated.